The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. At that time Jesus came to Jericho and intended to pass through the town. Now a man there named Zacchaeus, who was a chief tax collector and also a wealthy man, was seeking to see who Jesus was. But he could not see him because of the crowd, for he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree in order to see Jesus, who was about to pass that way. When he reached the place, Jesus looked up and said, "Zacchaeus, come down quickly, for today I must stay at your house." And he came down quickly and received him with joy. When they all saw this, they began to grumble, saying, "He has gone to stay at the house of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, "Behold, half of my possessions, Lord, I shall give to the poor. And if I have extorted anything from anyone, I shall repay it 4 times over." And Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a descendant of Abraham. For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save what was lost." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
This story of Jesus and Zacchaeus is it's one that takes me way back to some of my earliest memories as a child. When my brothers and sisters and I were little kids, Mom would sit us down, sort of close to bedtime, and she would read us a Bible story. And I remember some of them quite clearly. We had this sort of illustrated children's Bible. The story of the hand that appears out of nowhere and starts writing on the wall in the book of Daniel. The part where Abraham's cousin Lot's wife is turned into a pillar of salt because she looks back at Gomorrah. And then at the end of Mom reading the stories to us, we would draw a picture of what we thought the whole scene in the story would look like. And I'm sure that Mom still has those. She keeps things like that. And we all liked the story of Zacchaeus and Jesus because Mom would read us a story, and she would get to the part where the crowds are surrounding Jesus, and she would say, "So Zacchaeus climbed and then all of us would chime in, "sycamore tree," even though we had no idea what a sycamore tree was. But that was our part to chime in on. And so growing up basically in a forest next to the Big Blue River, we had a lot of trees to climb, so I thought it was pretty cool that there's a tree climbing incident in the Bible. Zacchaeus, the tree that he climbed is apparently still there. I'm not sure if that's possible. It's probably just a tourist trap. But 13 years ago when I got to see Jericho, when I went on pilgrimage to Israel, our tour guide sort of pointed it out to us as our bus drove by, just sort of, to the right, there's the tree that Zacchaeus climbed. Like, all right. There's no sort of explanation. It's very nonchalant, sort of a no big deal side comment that he made. But seeing the supposed tree that Zacchaeus climbed brought back a lot of those memories of Mom reading us stories. And aside from the tree climbing ability, the thing that makes Zacchaeus so appealing to me is that he is a character that gives us a lot of hope. Zacchaeus climbed that tree, a sinful man. I mean, everybody opposed him. That he was a tax collector. And like I was talking about last week, tax collectors in first century Israel were pretty well known for being crooks. They were given the task by the Roman Empire of collecting the taxes in Israel, and they basically overcharged and sort of, skimmed off the top, and everybody knew that's how tax collectors operated. And it says that Zacchaeus is a chief tax collector, which probably means that he was skimming the most off the top and that he was the most wealthy. And everybody knew this. That's how people regarded Zacchaeus. That's probably what they thought about him all the time. That's how they saw him. They viewed him as an extortionist and as a crook, and even worse, as an enemy sympathizer, a co-conspirator with the pagans who had turned his back on God and God's chosen people. But Jesus didn't see Zacchaeus in that way. Jesus saw Zacchaeus as a man who was intrigued enough with Jesus that he would go to the length of climbing a tree just to look at him, just to see him. Jesus didn't see just a sinner, he saw hope in Zacchaeus. Perhaps you or I wouldn't see hope in him, but Jesus does. He sees the simple act of climbing a tree as enough for Jesus to latch onto and bring him into God's good graces. Now, like I said, I have been to Jericho, and it is in the middle of a desert, which is called the Judean wilderness, and it was and remains a desert town. Jericho is the longest continuously inhabited city on earth. It's had people living there for 10,000 years straight. And you have to drive through the desert from Jerusalem, at least that's how we got there, and it's probably the most desolate, the most dusty, hot, barren place that I've ever been. When I think of desert, you usually think of like cactus and maybe creosote bushes or soapweed or maybe some lizards or scorpions or snakes or things like that. And, the Wild West, the stereotypical, bleached cattle skull in the sand. Or maybe you perhaps when you think of a desert, you think of, the huge sand dunes of the Saharan desert. But that's not what the Judean wilderness is like at all. There is no sign of life. There are no plants, no trees. There isn't even sand in the Judean wilderness. It's just hot, red sort of colored rock. It sort of looks like the surface of Mars. So imagine that you're Jesus, and it's hot, and it's dusty, and you have a huge crowd of people pressing in on you and making you even more hot, hotter still. Would you even notice the random guy that climbed a tree? And if you noticed him, would you take the time to make your way over to him and talk to him? And if you did that, would you continue talking to him after everybody had informed you that this guy was no good? That this guy was a crook? That he was probably looking for an opportunity to get in Jesus' good graces just for some sort of personal gain? Because maybe I'm a little cold-hearted, but that would be my assumption of this guy, right? I'm certainly not Jesus, because that's exactly what Jesus does. He takes the time to be with Zacchaeus, which, if you think about it, is quite remarkable. There are crowds all around him, and mobs of people all around him, and of all these people, it's Zacchaeus that gets Jesus' attention. Zacchaeus was the most important person to Jesus in this instance. Perhaps Jesus knew that this was Zacchaeus' last shot at turning a new leaf. Perhaps Jesus knew that the salvation of Zacchaeus' soul was on the line, so Zacchaeus was the most important person to him in that moment. And he zeroed in on him and he singled him out from the branches of the sycamore tree. And it's that aspect of the story that I want to talk about today. This aspect of Jesus keying in on Zacchaeus, of all the people that were there, zeroing in on him above everybody else. And I want to put an even finer point on it by turning to our first reading. Usually, our first reading is closely linked to the gospel to sort of show the connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament. It's always from the Old Testament for the most part. And at first glance, it would seem that there is no relationship whatsoever between the two stories that we hear about, the first reading and the gospel reading. But if we look at the story of Zacchaeus from that perspective that I'm talking about, that perspective of Jesus keying in on this one person that needed his love, then the connection between the two stories becomes a little bit more apparent. So let's go to our first reading. It's from the Book of Wisdom. Now, if you're not Catholic, the Book of Wisdom is not in your Bible. Martin Luther removed that book along with 6 other books in the 1520s. And to me, that's a huge mistake. The reason for that is that the 7 books of the Bible that he took out, they were the last Old Testament books written before the birth of Jesus. So leaving them out sort of leaves out a very important period in the story of God's chosen people, about 300 years of history where, if we left them out, it's a huge gap in our understanding of who God is. You see, in the Old Testament, mankind's understanding of who God is, it very gradually changes from beginning to end. Sort of in the beginning, we have this idea of God that he is a jealous God, a vengeful God, a God of wrath, a God who destroys his enemies. And that's our understanding of God in the beginning. But as the scriptures move on, and especially as we get to the last 7 books of the Old Testament, which are left out by Martin Luther, then we see that God is not vengeful, that he is a God of mercy, coming more and more to that understanding. And so, to me, it's a crime that a large chunk of Christians leave out that part of the Old Testament because they're leaving out that aspect of God. And I don't know how they jump to the God of the Old Testament to the God of the New Testament without that transition, because there's a big difference between the two. And I think that has done unlimited damage to our understanding of God himself, that we have this idea of God as a vengeful judge. But the Book of Wisdom shows us who God really is. So I'm going to simply read you the passage that Sandra did a wonderful job of reading it, but I'm going to read it again. And it's a beautiful passage. It's a passage that should move us to know who the true God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is, the God of mercy, the God of forgiveness, the God of love. And it's why Jesus went after Zacchaeus. It's why he singled him out. The Book of Wisdom says, "Before the Lord, the whole universe is as a grain from a balance or a drop of morning dew come down upon the earth. But you have mercy on all because you can do all things, and you overlook people's sins that they may repent. For you love all things that are, and loathe nothing that you have made. For what you hated you would not have fashioned. And how could a thing remain unless you willed it, or be preserved had it not been called forth by you? But you spare all things because they are yours, O Lord, and lover of souls. For your imperishable spirit is in all things. Therefore you rebuke offenders little by little, warn them, and remind them of the sins that they are committing, that they may abandon their wickedness and believe in you, O Lord." The whole universe is a drop of dew or a single grain, and God still loves you and cares for you and thinks of you. If God does not desire your existence, you would cease to exist. And not only that, any memory of you would never be or last if God were not constantly willing you to be, if God were not constantly thinking of you. He has mercy on all, he loves all, and hates none of his creation. For if he hated it, he wouldn't have created it in the first place. And that goes for the Zacchaeuses of the world. That goes for all of us. Nobody could ever be bad enough to be abandoned by God, to stop being loved by God, because God is love. Jesus is so much closer to us than we would like to believe. It's just that sometimes people look in the wrong places for him. They climb up the wrong tree, looking for what they think will make them happy. But that's what sin is. Sin is where we look where we want to see God, not where he actually is. Becoming a real disciple of Jesus is not a matter of waiting around for him to call out to us. It's a matter of us responding to that call that he's already made. We have to climb that tree ourselves, just like Zacchaeus. Recently, in past weeks, I've been talking about how as a parish we need to do better and do our best to see everybody as a child of God, especially the poor, especially those who struggle with illness, both physical and mental illness. And as Catholics, we're really good, I think, in a lot of areas when it comes to this. We're really good at putting efforts toward good causes. Our charity and stewardship appeal goes to support things like Catholic social services and counseling centers and homes for abused women that are seeking refuge. Our Bishop's Appeal for Vocations that we just finished last weekend, it goes a long way to support our seminarians. We're very generous when it comes to responding with the material needs of others. That's awesome. When a couple of weeks ago when I mentioned that we have sort of a little stash of cash squirreled away for people that are in a bind with gas money or repair bills or something like that, and the response was generous. I got a lot of cash donations toward that. And these are all good things that I'm very proud of as a pastor, that my people are so generous. This week I had a dozen men or so show up to hang the bulletin boards and the chalkboards in our newly renovated CCD classrooms, and all I had to do was promise them some Busch Light, and they all showed up. So given all of this, though, we can do even better as a church with helping each other directly. Real person-to-person contact, human help. And I know that's my job as a priest, but it's also our job as Christians and as human beings. So I'm going to give you just a couple of ways to maybe think about, a couple of examples in which we can do this, to have real, human contact, not just giving people the things that they need, but being there when they need you to be there. First example is this. There are people that I visit every week that they have very little other visitors, very little human contact. Some of them, outside of their doctor, I'm the only person that they really see throughout the course of the week. And for some of them, even their family doesn't call or visit them. And some of these people can be challenging to spend time with. They're in times very needy of emotional support because they are the only person that they spend time with. I am. Sometimes they're very negative or they're in despair, but they're worth it as persons. And I don't have to be the only person that visits them. So if you're interested, if you have the time, I can give you some people that would love some company. Another way that we can help those in need is through a thing that we're beginning to work on in the parish. It is something that is sort of sponsored by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, but it's being implemented at the local level at every parish. And that's something called Walking with Moms in Need. And this is sort of a gathering of resources, both religious and non-religious public resources that we're trying to pool together in order to help women who are facing crisis pregnancies. We're meeting on November 9th at 6:30 to begin the process of gathering that information. If you have any resources in mind that could help women in this type of situation, let me know. I've had lots of people have suggestions already, which is great. If we're opposed to things like abortion, then we must be the ones to give mothers every opportunity to be good mothers. That's just the truth of it. And these mothers, they might be cast in a negative light. These mothers, you might be able to correctly say that they're the cause of their own problems, but, Zacchaeus was also cast in a negative light, and Jesus ministered to him. The people that we reach out to, they deserve our attention, simply because they are people. We need to zero in on them like Jesus did, to go to them out of all the people in the crowds and minister to their needs. Perhaps the people that we reach out to, perhaps they need you just as much as Zacchaeus needed Jesus. Perhaps God uses us for the salvation of their souls. Jesus reached out to the poor. He reached out to sinners. And if we're going to call ourselves Christian, then we should be doing the same.